Welcome back to another episode of the Atheniano Show, where each episode is a new ripple containing unknown but unlimited impact. Today's episode will be about the Mau Mau Rebellion. Now, what is the Mau Mau Rebellion, you may ask? Well, the Mau Mau Rebellion was one of the most significant movements in modern African history, the result of which likely sped up Kenya's independence from the British in 1963. However, it also came at a brutal cost, with numerous Kenyans being subjected to unimaginable torture at the hands of the British. One of those Kenyans was Hussein Onyango Obama, the paternal grandfather of former U.S. President Barack Obama. The story of the Mau Mau Rebellion gives us fascinating insight into one of the most neglected but important moments in history, and this is worthy of a closer look. In order to fully understand the nature of the Mau Mau Rebellion, it is first necessary to learn a little bit about the colonial history of Kenya. So, the land that is now known as Kenya was first colonized by the Portuguese in the early 16th or late 15th century. Then, in 1698, the Omani Arab Empire took control of the land and was ruled by the Omani Sultan. Fun fact, it was actually during this Omani rule that slave trade in East Africa was accelerated. So fast forward now to 1895. And in 1895, the British took control of this land from the Sultan of Zanzibar, and the British called the area the East African Protectorate, which was later renamed in 1920 as the Colony of Kenya, after the highest mountain in the land. Now, it's important to note, within the native or local Kenyan population, there were and are many tribes to which people's allegiance was strong. The largest of those in Kenya are the Kikuyu, the Luo, the Luya, the Kamba, and the Kalenjin. Now, during the British rule of Kenya, they imposed many incredibly strict, harsh, and unfair laws that hurt the native population, and in particular had severely damaging effects on the Kikuyu people. Now, this will become important later on because it is the Kikuyus that primarily formed the brunt of the Mau Mau Rebellion. So, to give you some examples of these unfair and harsh laws that the British put in place, I'll name a few. So, in 1902, the British introduced a hut tax, which basically forced native Kenyans to work for the British in order to pay the tax. Then, in 1903, the British introduced a policy of relocation whereby many natives were forced to leave their land, particularly the most fertile parts, for example, the White Highlands, leave those parts to the settlers and go to African quote-unquote reserves where the British ruled over them. And these reserves were disguised as land that was, I guess, protected for Africans, but in reality, it was just to move them away from the most fertile parts and to give that space and more space to the white settlers. Additionally, the British Ordinance of 1939 eliminated any tenancy rights for squatters. And for those who don't know, squatters were the name given to Kenyans who worked for white settlers and were given small amounts of land in exchange for their labor. The majority of squatters, by the way, were also Kikuyus. Now, this ordinance caused the income of Kikuyu squatters to fall dramatically, with their income decreasing 30 to 40% during the 1940s. I could go on, and I will. Both after World War I and World War II, ex-British soldiers were awarded huge amounts of land in Kenya as part of their service, which caused massive influxes of white settlers after both wars. However, this policy of land granting was not applied to ex-Kenyan or African soldiers who served in the British Army. Now, as a result of this, the Kenyan African Union, or the KAU, was formed in 1942 by many ex-African soldiers to help campaign for greater land rights. It wasn't specifically because of the military land policy. It was a culmination of a lot of other bad policies toward the local Kenyans, but also this expedited its creation because it wasn't made up of many ex-soldiers who weren't given the same amount of benefits that white British soldiers had. So the KAU, the Kenyan African Union, in 1942, as I mentioned, was formed by many ex-African soldiers to help campaign for greater land rights. However, they weren't particularly successful. By 1948, 1.25 million Kikuyus had only 2,000 square miles of land, whereas 30,000 white settlers had 6 times that amount, had 12,000 square miles of land, most of which, again, was the most fertile lands. Additionally, the Kikuyu reserves were overcrowded and conditions were terrible, with poverty, unemployment, illness, and more plaguing the areas. In fact, by 1953, half of the Kikuyus owned no land. And many people actually ended up leaving their own lands and going to Nairobi, where frankly the conditions were not much better. From 1938 to 1952, the population of Nairobi went from 40,000 to 95,000, but Africans living there were paid way less than the settler population for the exact same jobs. And half of the Africans or Kenyans, however you want to call it, half of them employed were not actually making enough to support their individual needs, let alone their families. And as a result, as you can imagine, many locals were forced to sleep in, terrible conditions, with many times up to 10 people sleeping in the same room. And one of the final slaps in the face for this Kenyan population was in 1951, when the Kenyan African Union presented the British Labor Secretary with a series of proposals to improve the conditions of Kenyans. And he essentially laughed in their face, providing the smallest amount of concessions. So, for example, to give you one of his conditions was that Kenyans increase the amount of Kenyans on the Legislative Council increases from 4 people to 12 people. However, what the British did was they gave Kenyans 1 more. So from 4 representatives to 5 representatives. Now, to give you an idea of why that's preposterous, so again, local native Kenyans had a population of 5 million and only had 5 representatives, whereas the settlers were 30,000 people but had 14 representatives. So they weren't even asking for equal representatives as the settlers, which would be preposterous if they had equal amounts. But they were just asking for 12, and the British just gave them 5. They gave them 1 more. Now, this moment, along with the deteriorating conditions that I just mentioned, were key to the growth of the Mau Mau resistance, because it signified to many people that the political aims or an improvement in their living conditions could not be achieved through diplomatic means. It is from here that I will now talk about the specifics of the Mau Mau movement. So, most basically, the Mau Mau movement was a war between the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, the KLFA, and the British authorities. Now, as previously mentioned, the Mau Mau movement grew out of the increasingly oppressive policies by the British and the failure of the KAU to make any significant change to those policies through diplomacy and to achieve any kind of political independence. Hence, the main objectives of the Mau Mau movement were to secure their land back, to end racist and discriminatory policies, and to achieve political independence. Seems perfectly reasonable. I do want to mention, because I think it's important, membership in the Mau Mau movement, which was solidified by an oath, grew immensely in the late 1940s and in particular in the 1950s among the Kikuyus, with some estimates having 90% of Kikuyus having taken the oath. Now, I mentioned earlier the failure of the KAU to achieve real change as a jumpstart for the movement. But another key part of this movement to again achieve political independence, get their land back, and end racist and discriminatory policies. Another key part of this movement, which was equally, if not more important, was the declaration of the quote-unquote emergency in 1952 by the British as what was supposed to be a preemptive measure to quell the movement before it escalated and grew substantially. However, the emergency ended up having the complete opposite result. As the British moved to arrest 8,000 Kenyans suspected of involvement in the movement, many people felt that this was proof of a growing war or conflict between the Kenyans and the British, which only increased membership and involvement. For example, in 1953, the Central Committee of the Nairobi branch of the Kenyan African Union became determined to launch a war of liberations for the Kikuyus and the Kenyans more broadly. In doing so, they separated themselves into a passive and an active wing, with the passive wing being responsible for supplying weapons and supplies to the active wing, and the active wing's job was obviously to carry out the military duties of the Land and Freedom Army. Another part of this movement that I think is important to mention was the Mau Mau movement was primarily made up of lower working peasant class Kenyans, with trade unions playing a huge role in the movement/resistance. As a consequence, or I guess a factor in this working class element of the movement, was that it really created a sharp divide between the peasant or working class and the so-called loyalist or petty bourgeoisie of Kenyans, called the kulaks, who were better off than most Kenyans and were generally more sympathetic to the British, either more conservative, like less likely to want to fight against them, or just maybe sympathetic to them in other ways because they had opportunities to study abroad or whatever. So as a result of this, much of the early violence of the Mau Mau movement was actually directed against these loyalists or these kulaks, with an estimated 2,000 of them being killed by the Kenyan army. And one particularly notorious incident of this was the Lari massacre in 1953, which involved 3,000 Mau Mau overrunning a village overrunning the village of the loyalist chief Waka, where the village was destroyed and 70 plus people were murdered, with reports of children and women being effectively hacked to death. Now, this event was very significant because it became the key moment that the British used to basically discredit the rebellion as a beastly or unhuman movement. And this, at least in the minds of the British, gave them permission to commit atrocities against these Kenyans or the people participating, because they used it as kind of a justification, like, okay, these people are not really people, they're barbarians, and therefore should be treated as such. Now, obviously, that is propaganda. And it was a frequent tactic of the British to use the press and propaganda to dismantle the cause of the Mau Maus and portray them, as I said, as barbarians, as not a legitimate movement, when obviously their cause was legitimate. You can question the means, but you cannot question the cause. And that's what the British really tried to do through propaganda. Now, in the immediate aftermath of this Lari incident, the British killed hundreds of suspected Mau Maus, and much more was followed. In April 1954, for example, the British began Operation Anvil in Nairobi, with the stated goal of that operation being to eliminate the Mau Mau resistance in Nairobi, which was regarded as the nerve center of operations because it was suspected that people there were smuggling weapons in Nairobi to the highlands, where the fighting between the British and the KLFA predominantly happened. As a result of this operation, 25,000 British troops closed off the exit from the city and gathered up almost all the native population for identification and to check if they were associated with the Mau Mau movement, which you can see these tactics are, you can see a lot of parallels between these tactics of rounding up people with very little basis. You can see a similar tactic to other large powers or colonial powers resisting anti-colonial movements. One strong parallel that I'm seeing here is with the Algerian War of Independence. The French frequently rounded up huge groups of people just purely based on race and looks. Additionally, 19 of the officers from the Transport and Allied Workers Union and the Domestic and Hotel Workers Union, who, as I mentioned before, played a large role in the movement, were beheaded by the British during Operation Anvil. And even after Anvil, most of the Kikuyus were exported out of Nairobi, with 20,000 Mau Mau suspects detained and 30,000 more basically deported to the quote-unquote African reserves. Now, it is important to note that the Operation Anvil really did hurt the Mau Mau movement, particularly with regards to gaining support from non-Kikuyu tribes, because it indicated that the cost of joining the movement was too high. And it also, as I mentioned, effectively disbanded the previous operations of the Nairobi Central Committee, which was key to supplying the army in the highlands. Additionally, after conducting this kind of operation in Nairobi, the British did the same thing in many other parts of Kenya. And by the beginning of 1955, an estimated 80,000 Kikuyus were arrested, and an estimated 1 million Kikuyus were deported from the highlands to the reserves, which created an even more massive overcrowding situation, and as well as starvation, as the people were put in these reserves and were guarded by British soldiers. They were put there without food or jobs or even land, really. Now, at this moment, I want to pause because I think we need to be clear about what the British were doing here, about rounding up all of these Kikuyus or Kenyans more broadly and putting them in small concentrations of land. This is concentration camps. These were concentration camps that the British were using against the Kenyan population, right? They called it villagization. But they put over 1 million Kikuyus from multiple districts into tiny villages that were surrounded by trenches and barbed wire and watched over by colonial authorities, which ended up causing severe food shortages and starvation, with some estimates saying over 20,000 children under the age of 10 dying from starvation and other related diseases. There's no other way to say it. This is them putting them in concentration camps and them dying in concentration camps, right? Like the exact same thing that the Nazis did to Jews. Additionally, the British also publicly executed 1,000 people, 500 of which were executed for crimes that were much less than murder. And for reference, this is double the number of executions that the French did to the Algerians, and way less than the number that the British did in either Cyprus or in the British Mandate of Palestine. Additionally, 20,000 there were 20,000 Mau Mau militant deaths, as well as a possible 100,000 Africans killed because of various factors by the British. Now, for comparison, right, let's just take 120,000. Somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 were killed by the Mau Mau rebels. So on the one hand, the British kill 120,000. On the other hand, approximately 2,000 to 5,000 killed by the Mau Mau rebels. So you tell me, what you guys, I'll leave you guys to do the proportionality of those numbers. In addition, the people who were detained by the British authorities, the Kenyans who were detained by the British authorities, were subjected to immense torture, if not killed, of which the British later paid in 2013 insignificant reparations. Now, one of those detainees was Hussein Onyango Obama, a former cook in the British Army and grandfather to Barack Obama. And he, as has been reported, had pins forced into his fingernails and buttocks and had his testicles squeezed in between metal rods in detention. But again, he was hardly the exception. According to historian Robert Edgerton, quote, electric shock was widely used. Women choked and held underwater. Gun barrels, beer bottles, and knives, end quote, were thrust into them if either they did not answer the question to the satisfaction of the authorities, or the suspect simply refused to answer. Some were just simply shot if the suspects did not answer the question to the satisfaction of the British authorities, or if they just refused to speak. Moreover, Carol Atkins, a historian and professor of African Studies at Harvard University, in her book, Britain's Gulag, The Brutal End of Empire in Kenya, wrote that broken bottles, quote, gun barrels, knives, snakes, vermin, and hot eggs were thrust up into men's rectums and women's vaginas. Now, these are horrific tactics and horrific torture, right? That probably many of you listening have not heard about. But unfortunately, these horrific tactics did, in some ways, succeed in the short term in quelling the movement by stripping supply lines and deterring, quote unquote, more conservative people from participating in the movement. And so the specific Mau Mau movement started to die down after these, quote unquote, operations, if you want to call them that. However, even though the Mau Mau movement technically failed to win or defeat the British in this moment, it is very significant for Kenya's history going forward, particularly with regard to its independence from the British in 1963. So let's now speak about some, takeaways or impacts from this Mau Mau movement. So first, as I mentioned, a crucial part of the Mau Mau movement was mobilizing and giving political consciousness to the agrarian and peasant sectors. Being a part of such a movement really helped shape national identity or national conscience and really helped to bring about a strong anti-colonial sentiment throughout the country, which maybe was present before the Mau Mau movement, but had not really manifested into something definite yet. Remember, Kenya as a nation never really existed until 1963, since before the colonizations, it was a land made up of numerous tribes and people. The idea of nations and nationalities and nationhood, that's a relatively modern and new phenomenon in most parts of the world. And it's not really something that was, adopted by most of the world until fairly recently. So the resistance to the colonial policies and the shared struggle in the movement, as well as the experience of it, really helped kind of formulate this national consciousness. Really helped formulate this national consciousness among Kenyans. And perhaps telling, I don't know if this really means anything, but the first president from Kenya was a Kikuyu, albeit a moderate, but he was arrested. Now, the other part of the Mau Mau movement, besides helping facilitate this national identity and helping make people more politically conscious, which ultimately helped accelerate the process, or likely helped accelerate the process to independence in 1963. The other part of the movement is that it helped convince many in the British ranks that a permanent solution to the situation in Kenya could not be found without the European settlers leaving, and the Kenyans ruling control of themselves. Now, this actually included former British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, who made remarks to this avail. So again, you have really two parts of three, that the Mau Mau movement had in leading toward the independence of Kenya in 1963. One was the giving political consciousness to the agrarian and peasant sectors. The second was helping establish a national identity or unity. And the third was relatedly helping basically convince British authorities that they needed to leave because the situation was no longer feasible for the European settlers to stay and for the Kenyans to not be in control of themselves. I also want to say that besides these takeaways and their relevance to Kenya's history, I do have some takeaways that I want to share with you from doing research on the Mau Mau movement. So the first is that the British were essentially using Nazi tactics right after the war, World War II, right? By putting them in concentration camps, rounding them up, and making people starve to death, right? It's so, and the French did the same thing in Algeria. It's so crazy to me, right? That less than 10 years after the end of World War II, the British turn around and end up using the tactics that presumably was the reason why they fought against the Nazis, right? The Nazis are so inhumane, and I 100% agree with that. The Nazis are so inhumane and terrible people and did terrible things, but then the British turn around and almost basically use the same thing. Like, what hypocrisy? So that's one point. The second point is that there's a lot of parallels in the response to the Mau Mau movement to responses to other anti-colonial movements, whereby the response of the colonizer nation to the anti-colonial movement is incredibly disproportional and inhumane, with involving the roundup of huge proportions of the population and moving them to other parts of the land. And it seems to me that these disproportionate responses, and again, this is just me hypothesizing, is because of, this hysterical like mindset or a phobia. Because I think deep inside, the colonial nation knows that they're wrong, right? And that they are in the wrong, and that the people that are campaigning for change are really in the right. And so when you know deep down that you're in the wrong, and you know that what you should do is not what you want to do or what you're willing to do, you kind of have this like hysterical or phobic response where you start to do crazy shit and start to do really, really bad things. And this is not just like, I'm not the first person to say this, and this is hardly the first case of that, right? You can see it all the way, like Macbeth is a perfect example where you start to do one bad thing, and then people are trying to hold you accountable for that bad thing, and your response to them trying to hold you accountable or to bring justice is to do even more bad stuff, and to, like, because you're afraid deep down that they will achieve their goal, because in your mind you know that, like, the tide is against you. And so you're much more violent when you're fighting against the tide. The tide of, like, good, I would say. The third point I want to make is I want to respond to a potential argument that people have who say, well, the British, were maybe justified because the Mau Mau movement was violent, and violence is bad, so the British needed to use this disproportionate amount of violence to respond to the Mau Mau violence, because that was all they knew, and that was the only way they were going to stop. And even if you don't believe that the British should have used so much force, you may still say, well, ultimately the Mau Mau movement was responsible because they initiated the violence, which they should not have done. Now, to this, I'd say I agree that violence is bad of course, in almost all circumstances, I agree with you. I'm on the same page there. I'm like the closest person to anti-violence that you could get. But you would be incredibly naive if you believe this, to think that there's no difference between violence to achieve political objectives or unwarranted violence. There is a strong difference, right? And the fact that the Mau Mau insurgents were using violence to achieve political objectives does not mean that they are somehow violent or brutal people, or perhaps more to the point, that they should be treated as beastly animals or barbarians the way the British did to them. You know, not only did the British use more brutal and barbaric Nazi-esque tactics, but also I just want to point out, like, the failure among a lot of people to recognize the obvious point, which is that when you push other people to extremes and take their livelihoods and refuse to make any concessions and double down and push them to incredibly impoverished conditions and deny them any change when they go peacefully or diplomatically, they will almost always go to extremes to achieve a better quality of life, to be treated fairly, to get justice. Right? I was going to use an analogy with, when you, with like dog fighting, right? You have these dogs that have all this like good in them, but then when you treat them like shit and push them around, of course they're going to turn into these violent creatures. And who could blame them? And humans are not that different. When you push them to extremes and make them hungry and strip them of their land and strip them of their rights and refuse to treat them any better after they ask and try to make concessions, what do you expect? Right? You're incredibly naive to think that people won't respond that way. And I'm somebody that would like to think that I could be like, this Jesus figure, okay. Let me rephrase that. Somebody who could like embody the principles of like, Gandhi or a Jesus, passive resistance, refusing violence, and, turning the other cheek. Like, I wish and I aspire to that. But we cannot be so naive to think that, like, that's what everybody does. Okay? That is incredibly difficult, incredibly strong. It takes an incredibly strong will. And to hold people to that standard, especially when you yourselves are doing the exact opposite and using incredibly brutal and harsh tactics, is incredibly unfair. What was I going to say? I was going to say something, right? So look, the point I'm trying to make is that when you push other people to extremes and take their livelihoods, they will go to extremes. And we all have this part of us in us to do this. Clearly, just as we all have good in us, we also all possess a lot of evil, right? And so this evil can be triggered in us when we are pushed to an end. And pretending that either of those things, either the good or the evil or the bad or whatever, is not true and is not in us, is just incredibly unhelpful. We need to recognize, this is I don't think this is like a complicated point for people to grasp, right? That when you push people to a certain point, that malicious part of them, which we all have again, will come out, or at least will be triggered to a point where it is quite likely that it will come out. I hope that makes sense. The last thing I want to say about this is none of this is black and white. Nothing, I don't care what anybody says, nothing is black and white. And so even though this video makes the British look very bad, and for good reason they look bad, it is important to point out that I mentioned in the beginning that it was under the Omani Arab rule that slave trade was accelerated in East Africa. Well, it was actually largely due to the British that the slave trade ceased or was eliminated in East Africa. So make of that what you will. So that concludes my video. I do want to say, if you're Kenyan, or if you have additional stories, testimonies, etc., please feel free to write them and share them in the chat or email them to me through Instagram, email, Facebook, whatever. I'd love to have more additional resources or stories or testimonies. And I could share those anonymously if you like, or if you feel comfortable sharing them publicly, you can put them in the chat, please. I don't pretend to be a quote-unquote like expert, whatever that means, on this issue. But the information here that I've done is due to reading and is due to reading that I've done of other people's testimonies and research. But I'm sure that there's even more nuanced information and a more detailed perspective that I've missed in this video, and I would love for you to share that in the comments. I will also include links to many great resources and articles that I used for this video in the description, which provide a more detailed explanation of the Mau Mau Rebellion if you are interested in learning more about it. The saying in this podcast is, quiet the waves, create new ripples. So the goal is for you to have gotten something from this video, for me to have created a ripple which affects you in some way, or that gives you something in some way, however small, that you can then apply to your life or your knowledge or whatever. And so if I've done that in some way, that is the goal. For you to get something out of it, to leave some ripple effect in your life. Because this is a story of immense brutality, and one that's really important. And it's really important to remember when such horrific things are committed by people, or more specifically, against certain people. And I think particularly in my country and part of the world that I've spent the most time, this really does not get taught or talked about enough. So I hope to make a small ripple effect on that with this video. And if you liked it and you feel like you got something out of it, please help support me by subscribing and liking this video. So yeah, thank you so much for listening if you've made it to the end. Again, hope you decide to support us by subscribing, liking the video, and also to stay up to date on future videos that we do. So thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful rest of the day wherever you are in the world and whatever time it is that you're listening. And peace out. God bless.